Hello, YouTube and Wooper Club fans. I am Elfowls, coach of the Newport Noctowls, and I'll be subbing in for Fruit Taco today to bring you a feature match for the playoffs of WCL Season 13. We're going to be covering round 1 of the playoffs, that being the quarterfinals, and we have an exciting match for you today. This is going to be between the number 1 seeded Calgary Corviknight and the number 8 Cincinnati Incineroar. The Corviknight have been on an absolute tear this season, only taking one loss in Week 4, to end up grabbing the season's only 7-1 record, easily sliding into the number 1 position and showing that, despite their short time in the main league, they are not a team to be taken lightly. Meanwhile, the Incineroar have been more of a mixed bag this season, but they've been putting up some impressive performances as well, beating some of the league's top teams to get to a 5-3 record and comfortably grabbing the 8th position for playoffs. Both of these teams are hungry for a playoff win. The Corviknight are looking to break into that top echelon of teams in this league, and a season championship to cap off this very successful regular season would make a huge statement for them. The Incineroar, on the other hand, probably want a championship even more, given their long history in the league, missing out on the championship at least a few times now. But they've been on the rise lately, so this could be the season they finally make a full playoffs run to the championship title. It all starts here in the quarterfinals. Let's jump right into the matchup. The Calgary Corviknight have put together a team of Iron Valiant, who cannot Terra, Sneasel, Thunderous Incarnate, who cannot Terra, Rotom Mo, Girafarig, Tatsugiri, Regidrago, Dreadnought, Skeletor, who cannot Terra, Scizor, who can't Terra, and Diancie. And the Incineroar are rocking with a team of Wugtrio, Iron Shreds, who cannot Terra, Espathra, who cannot Terra, Haxorus, who cannot Terra, Mimikyu, Primeape, Moltres, Hisuian Quillfish, Wigglytuff, Dondozo, who can't Terra, and Quagsire. And looking at the matchup, starting with the speed tiers, we do have a weird dynamic to look at first. The Incineroar, of course, have the fastest Pokemon in the matchup with Wugtrio, but I'm unsure of how relevant that's going to be compared to the Corviknight's fastest Pokemon. Iron Valiant, Sneasel, and Thunderous feel like much larger threats, while soaring over the speed tiers of anything else the Incineroar have. Meanwhile, as we climb down the ladder of speed tiers, there are some huge gaps for both teams. The Corviknight have a jump down from base 111 to base 86, a gap in which most of the Incineroar's offense exists. And the Incineroar's speed drops off a cliff after base 85, which gives the Corviknight the edge on the slower end of the spectrum, but the Incineroar's slowest threats do at least discourage Trick Room as a method of turning the tables on their offense. It's tough to give either team the edge in speed here, but I think I will hand it to the Incineroar. Based on raw numbers, they do have the fastest mon in the matchup, and I think the Corviknight's speed gap will matter more than the Incineroar's, since that 90 to 110 range is where I expect most of the offense will be happening in this matchup. That being said, Iron Valiant and Thunderous are just such gigantic threats that they're just going mostly uncontested on speed, so it's tough to make a call here. As far as individual matchups go, I've already been alluding to it, but Iron Valiant looks amazing on the side of the Corviknight. It outspeeds almost everything, and it can even apply a booster energy to get the jump on Wugtrio, as well as any potential Scarfers. And it has access to all the coverage it would ever want for this matchup. A late game sweep from this thing seems like a sound strategy for the Corviknight. As far as actually breaking through the Incineroar's team, they're dealing with the bulky pieces of Dondozo, Moltres, Quagsire, and Quillfish, so I'm thinking the Corviknight should turn to special offense to bypass some of those big physical walls. They do have plenty of options for that, including the extremely powerful Regidrago, as well as Tatsugiri and Skeletor, but I have my eyes on the two electric types, Thunderous and Rotom Mo, as the most threatening mid-game pieces. The Incineroar's only answers to electric moves are their two ground types, Iron Shreds and Quagsire, and neither of them are exactly eager to switch in on a potential Rotom Leaf Storm or Will-O-Wisp, or a Thunderous Focus Blast, so I can see either of those two putting in a lot of work. We could see all that offense paired up with Scizor as a bulky steel type to prevent Espathra or Haxorus from getting out of hand, and Diancie also stands out as a utility piece that can check the otherwise threatening Moltres. On the side of the Incineroar, Iron Shreds is a paradigm of utility and feels like a near mandatory bring for this matchup. Its defensive typing blocks Volt Switch from the likes of Rotom and Thunderous while also resisting Regidrago's Dragon moves, and its combination of Stab Earthquake, Knockoff, and Hazard Control just bring so much to the table for this team. And speaking of auto brings, Dondozo invalidates several physical attackers on the Corviknight's side, which makes it a huge piece in this matchup. Quillfish, Wigglytuff, or Moltres could help round out a defensive core for the Incineroar. Moltres notably prevents Iron Valiant from spamming either of its stab moves. Wigglytuff can provide crucial Wish support for the team, and Quillfish could provide the hazards and toxic chip necessary for this bulky core to outlast the opponent. That definitely seems like the strategy the Incineroar have favored so far this season, but that's not to say they can't go offensive, as Pathra and Haxorus stand out as threatening sweepers that can snowball out of control given the right opportunity, and Mimikyu can similarly set up a free Swords Dance and sweep a weakened Corviknight team under the right circumstances. If I have to guess, I think that's the game plan for the Incineroar. Use a 3 or 4 man defensive core to whittle away at the Corviknight's defenses, and once enough chip has gone around, use one of those sweepers to clean up the endgame. If I'm forced to make a choice, I would probably favor the Corviknight going into this matchup. That's partially based on their performance this season going into the playoffs, but also the power of Iron Valiant, supported by the combination of bulk and wall breaking on that team. It just makes for such a great foundation to build a team off of. That being said, I don't think it's a free win by any means. The Incineroar have a ton of bulk on their side, as well as several offensive threats that can steal a game at any moment. This is going to be a good one. Let's see what each coach brought. Looking at the Corviknight, we get to start right away with that Iron Valiant, which looks like a terrifying late game sweeper with a booster energy Calm Mindset. It's running Moonblast and Aurasphere as consistent stab moves, and actually the only coverage it needs is Thunderbolt to hit that Moltres, which resists dual stabs, as well as claiming more damage against Dondozo. The set is pretty much what I expected out of a late game sweeper, but things get a little more interesting with the EV spread. We have a Timid Nature with enough speed investment to outrun Booster Energy Iron Treads, as well as +1 Espathra, assuming Iron Valiant's Booster Energy is in effect. But then we have max HP, and the rest of the EVs are in defense, so this looks like a much bulkier take on Iron Valiant, sacrificing immediate power for more setup opportunities. I was able to find some pretty neat calcs from this set. For example, Max Attack Iron Treads Iron Head is a roll to KO standard Iron Valiant, but this EV spread survives it pretty comfortably. This set also takes a lot of weaker hits pretty well. Mimikyu's Life Orb Shadow Sneak barely does more than 20%, and Dondozo's Liquidation tops out at 30%. This means that even if the set isn't claiming a KO every turn, it can still sweep by merit of its surprising bulk. I will say, I don't know if the power sacrifice is quite worth it for me. This set almost never 2-hit KOs max HP Dondozo with Thunderbolt, and notably, compared with a max special attack Iron Valiant, Aurasphere goes from always 1-hit KOing offensive Iron Treads to never 1-hit KOing it. Calcs like that are a heavy price to pay in case you need to immediately KO something and find yourself unable to. But to be fair, that really isn't the point of this set. It's very clearly trying to get in once during the endgame, boost up once or twice, and clean up a weakened team. I do really like this set. I think it's very creative, and I'm interested in seeing what it can do in this battle. Of course, if you're going to go with that idea, you definitely need a lot of support in the form of pivots and wall breakers to wear your opponent's team down. So we're going to start that pivoting game off with Assault Vest Scizor with max HP and max special defense. This is a dedicated Espathra counter, taking pitiful damage from even boosted psychic moves. This set is still running an Impish Nature, which, as the coach told me, allows this set to at least tank a hit from Iron Treads and retaliate with a super effective close combat. Outside of that, Bullet Punch and U-Turn are pretty standard and great moves for Scizor, and Technician boosted Pounce offers some nice speed control while still being a powerful stab move that deals with that Espathra. This is a pretty great set. Greg seems to have a solid plan for it, and I don't think he's even missing any utility moves by opting for the Assault Vest. Traditionally, you'd love to fit Defog somewhere on Scizor, but the coach told me that leaving it behind was an intentional decision to avoid proccing Primate's Defiant. I guess if that's the case, I do have to mention that using Pounce also gives the Primate that Defiant opportunity by switching in, but that's pretty heavy nitpicking at that point. This is a solid set for sure. Moving on, we have one of those special wall breakers that I was talking about with Choice Specs Regidrago. It's running max special attack Modest for some truly ridiculous power, as well as just enough speed to outrun uninvested Quillfish. And the remaining EVs have been placed into defense, making this surprisingly bulky on the physical side. That, combined with the chosen Terra type of Poison, allows this Regidrago to be a pretty solid check to the multiple Fairy types on the Incineroar's team, as well as that Quillfish. The Poison typing allows Regidrago to be immune to any direct Toxic attempts, and it also gains the ability to absorb Toxic spikes on switch-in. As far as moves, we have Dragon Energy, which hits like a truck from full HP, Draco Meteor as a secondary stab option, Earth Power as nice coverage for that Iron Treads, and Terra Blast, which combines with Terra Poison to become the best option to hit Mimikyu and Wigglytuff. I have no complaints about this set. It appears to be the primary Terra option for this team, and I think that's a great way to lure in those Fairy types and absorb Toxic spikes. Next up, we have a support set with Screens Diancie, holding a Light Clay for those extended Reflect and Light Screen turns. The set itself is pretty standard screens, max HP and defense to take hits from the numerous physical attackers on Matt's side, and dual stabs in Diamond Storm and Moonblast to hit harder than you might think for such a defensive set. I really like the idea with this Diancie. The screen setup is pretty clearly for that Iron Valiant, and if Greg manages to start setting up with that bulky calm mindset between dual screens, that's a very good position to be in. My only complaint here is that Diancie is a pretty intuitive answer to Moltres, so choosing not to invest in any special defense, plus the lack of leftovers recovery on this, might mean that Moltres can break through this Diancie faster than it otherwise would have. But Diancie's natural bulk can absolutely help to fend that thing off, especially with the ability to set light screen for itself, so I'm not too concerned about it yet. Moving on, we have Rotom Mow, running a max HP, max defense set with leftovers, and this is a pretty solid check to Dondozo, taking minimal damage from anything it can throw out and threatening with Stab, Leaf Storm, or Thunderbolt. Volt Switch still threatens Dondozo with heavy damage while also pivoting Rotom out of any non-ground type switch-ins, and Will-O-Wisp is a great status to throw around at all of the Incineroar's physical attackers. Lastly, Terra Dark is a bit niche, but here it's being used as a last-ditch counter for Espathra, which seems unlikely to run any coverage aside from Psychic moves and Shadow Ball. I'm a big fan of this set. It's pretty simple, but it has such a solid matchup into the Incineroar that simple will work just fine. You definitely need a Dondozo switch in for this matchup, and this not only switches well into Dondozo, it's also very threatening to the rest of the team. I don't think there's anything on the Incineroar's side that's comfortable with switching into the combination of Volt Switch, Leaf Storm, and Will-O-Wisp, so expect to see this Rotom put in a lot of work. And lastly on this team, we have Tatsugiri with, you guessed it, max HP, max defense, wearing heavy-duty boots. It's got Storm Drain as the ability, so we won't be attempting to use Commander on the opponent's Dondozo today. Missed opportunity. But the water immunity combined with the defense investment does make this a pretty decent backup check to most standard Dondozo sets, as well as Wugtrio for good measure. The moveset is pretty standard, but has a lot of utility here. Rapid Spin makes this the team's sole hazard remover, and combined with Surf gives it a great matchup against Iron Shreds. Draco Meteor is the other stab move of choice, and I actually really like it here as a way to take advantage of the multiple unaware users on the opponent's team. They'll actually ignore Tatsugiri's special attack drops, so Draco Meteor suddenly becomes a spammable move in some situations. Lastly, Taunt seems like a nice extra tool to really stop Dondozo and Quagsire from getting anything done in this matchup. Terra Water potentially drops weaknesses to Dragon and Fairy from Haxorus, Espathra, and Mimikyu, respectively, while also powering up Surf to very respectable levels. I do like this set, it seems to have a solid purpose. This is a very well built team. I think my only comments overall are on the lack of hazard setters, which could have been very useful for the long pivoting game that's likely to play out here, as well as the abundance of physically defensive spreads. It makes sense the Incineroar certainly have a team stacked with physical threats, but with only Scizor as a true specialty defensive option, getting that one Pokemon weakened might open the door for a late game Espathra sweep. You'll have to be careful. Still though, the Corviknight have brought a formidable team for the matchup. I think all eyes are on that Iron Valiant to clean up the endgame with all the team support it has behind it. Let's see what the Corviknight's opponents have prepared to challenge them. Kicking off the Incineroar's team, we have Mimikyu with a Life Orb set. We have Max Attack Jolly with enough speed to always outrun Rotom Mow. We have Swords Dance set up, making use of that free turn of Disguise of course. And for attacking options, we're working with Play Rough and Shadow Claw as strong stabs, as well as Shadow Sneak for a strong priority option. Terra Dark is kind of a weird option, but it does notably give Mimikyu an immunity to Prankster T-Wave from Thundurus, as well as a resistance to Skeletor's Ghost moves, although I don't expect it to outright solve either of those matchups. I don't think we were ever going to see this Terra come up with another option in a later slot available, but it does strike me as kind of niche. Overall though, this Mimikyu set is about as standard as they come, but that's not a dig against it. Mimikyu certainly isn't sweeping outright, but with a free Swords Dance under its belt, it can be a useful tool to help break down the opponent's team in the early game or sweep in the late game with boosted Shadow Sneak. There's a surprising lack of hard checks to this Mimikyu on the Corviknight's team, so I would call this a great matchup call from the Incineroar. Up next, we have Iron Shreds with a specially defensive set holding leftovers. Max HP and 160 special defense with a careful nature, and enough speed to outrun max speed modest Rotom Mow. This looks like a blanket check to a couple of different threats, taking hits well from the likes of Thundurus, Regidrago, Diancie, Rotom, or Draffrig. As far as moves go, Rapid Spin makes this the team's hazard remover, Earthquake is the reliable stab move of choice, Stealth Rock of course to set up your own hazards, and Volt Switch for momentum. I think this set does really miss moves like Knockoff or Ice Spinner to better handle the Rotom and Thundurus, but I do understand that Iron Treads needs to be packed with utility moves for this team. Hazard Control and Momentum are very important roles to fill, so this set will just have to work with Earthquake as its only real offense. And it could be worse. It is only avoided by those opposing electric types, ironically enough. Moving along, we have that Dondozo with leftovers and a fully specially defensive EV spread, running Curse, Rest, Liquidation, and Order Up. Very fun move in the last slot there. The specially defensive investment turns Dondozo into a mixed unaware wall with its naturally high HP and defense, and of course that lends itself to the classic Curse setup strategy. It's interesting that Matt went with 2 attacks rather than opting for a mono-attacking Rest Talk set, since Dondozo can become a bit of a sitting duck during its 2 turns of sleep. But Order Up as a second offensive option actually grants Dondozo perfect neutral coverage in the matchup, as the only water resists were Rotom and the Dragon types, those being Regidrago and Tatsugiri. I'm sure the set is aiming to wall up on a few big threats and then potentially transition to a late game Curse sweep with the right opportunity. Solid set, Dondozo is a big threat, moving on. In the next slot, we have Hisuian Qwilfish, with full physically defensive investment, Intimidate, and an Eviolite to tank physical attacks all day from the likes of Scizor, Diancie, Sneasel, and physical Iron Valiant. We're looking at a moveset of Toxic Spikes, Spikes, Toxic, and Barb Barrage, so we're seeing a pretty hard commitment to chip damage on this set. I don't know, if it were me building, I probably would have dropped at least one of the hazards to avoid redundancy, but Matt has been relying on Toxic and Hazards chip as a consistent strategy this season, so I understand wanting to always have the right tool to get that chip damage going. For a mono-tagging set, Barb Barrage isn't too bad either. It leaves you completely countered by a potential Defog Scizor, but otherwise it's a surprisingly threatening move. It targets the Iron Valiant for super effective damage, and even the Poison Resist don't want to switch in out of fear of getting poisoned and chipped down. Lastly, Terra Dark stands out as another odd choice. With no Dark Stab to boost, the only benefit I see here is dropping a ground weakness for Dreadnaught's Earthquake, but otherwise this Terra makes Qwilfish's matchups almost exclusively worse across the board. I don't think the Qwilfish was ever a Terra candidate in the first place, so it doesn't really matter, but this is a small optimization I would like to see. Still though, this set has the tools to do what it needs to do. Get the opponent's team chipped down into range of your sweepers. Speaking of those sweepers, we're going to finally move on to this crazy Moltres set, which heavily contrasts the defensive pivoting role that we're used to seeing it in this season. This Moltres is running max special attack Modest with a Life Orb, as well as agility to double its speed and go for a sweep. Speaking of that speed, I'm not exactly sure what this is invested for. The best I can find is that this outruns Adamant Dreadnought, as well as Scarf Modest Iron Valiant after an agility. But unless I'm missing something, and I very well could be, the speed investment does look unoptimized, at least a bit. I would have liked to see enough speed investment to outrun Booster Energy Timid Iron Valiant, which this cannot do. Maybe the set is trying to catch that Iron Valiant speed creeping down, but if that's the case, it didn't quite work out. At +2, this set still barely underspeeds a +1 Iron Valiant that the opponent did bring. In fact, it would have only taken 12 more EVs to outspeed Iron Valiant in this match. We'll see if that makes a difference in the battle. Apart from that though, this does look like a really cool set. Moltres has some incredible power with a max investment and a Life Orb, so an agility boost is a great way to make use of that for a late game sweep. Flamethrower and Terra Ground Terra Blast get perfect coverage into the opponent's team, and that Terra Ground also has quite a bit of defensive utility. It gives Moltres an electric immunity, which means that it could set up on Thunderbolt from any of Rotom, Thundurus, or Iron Valiant, and also means that Thundurus can't stop its sweep with a Prankster Thunderwave. Lastly, U-Turn stands out as a little weird on a sweeping set that I don't expect to see pivoting around too much, especially with its Stealth Rock weakness, but I do like the thought of being able to pivot out of a bad matchup for some chip damage if you can't quite get a sweep going. This is a really cool set. Let's see how it works in action. I'm really excited to see this thing work out. And lastly, we have Espathra, which is running another interesting set. We have leftovers as well as max HP, max special attack Modest for a more offensive take on the Calm Mind Speed Boost set. And this is a Calm Mind set, but we are notably lacking stored power, instead opting for Lumina Crash alongside Dazzling Gleam and Shadow Ball for coverage. This feels weird, but I do actually really like it. Compared to standard Calm Mind Espathra, which takes some time to get going, this set is a lot more immediately threatening. With max special attack Lumina Crash, Espathra gains the ability to one-hit KO max HP Iron Valiant, making this a pretty decent check to it. Lumina Crash also prevents Skeledirge from being a reliable switch-in, lowering its special defense to be taken out by a Shadow Ball in the next turn. Meanwhile, Calm Mind allows Espathra to be a sweeping threat on top of that, potentially taking advantage of the force switches caused by Lumina Crash drops. Without Roost in the moveset, it is lacking longevity, but its purpose seems to be dropping in and getting off as much damage as possible, as quickly as possible. This is another set that I'm excited to see in action. Overall, despite some minor sub-optimizations, in my opinion, the team appears to have a strong game plan. Wear the opponent down with residual damage, and then clean up the late game with one of your very threatening sweepers. Espathra and Moltres work especially well for this, with one likely breaking for the other. With both teams locked in, this is looking like it's going to be a great game, so let's jump right into this match. So, here we are in the battle. Looking around the teams, I'm sure the Incineroar are relieved to see no Thundurus, since that Mon would have been a big offensive threat. The Rotom is still there though, and Iron Valiant is looming in the back, so they'll have to play carefully. Meanwhile, the Corviknight probably aren't too surprised by any of the Incineroar's brings, which appear to just consist of 4 defensive pieces, alongside Mimikyu and Espathra for offense. For leads, I think the Corviknight could kick things off with something like Rotom, which is a pivot with nice matchups across the board, or maybe Scizor as a different pivot that matches up better into the Qwilfish. As for the Incineroar, that Qwilfish could get hazards up early while threatening the reasonably likely Rotom lead, or honestly they could just get their offense going immediately with something like Mimikyu or Espathra. But without further ado, let's get into it. Quarterfinals start right here and now. We're going to see the leads of Mimikyu and Regidrago, so both coaches decided to immediately start with their breakers. And if I'm Matt, I'm very happy to see this matchup, but honestly Greg probably isn't too upset about this either. With its Terra type of poison and all of its defense investment, Regidrago was meant to be a counter to Mimikyu. It's just a matter of whether or not Greg wants to use that trick this early. He is going to Terrasilize on turn 1 as the Mimikyu goes for a Swords Dance, and the disguise is broken by a Terra Blast. Well, both of these plays make sense. Mimikyu taking advantage of the free turn offered by either a Force Switch or Disguise, and Regidrago staying in to ensure Mimikyu doesn't get too many of those free turns. Both sides are committed now, though, so on the next turn, Mimikyu is going to set up another Swords Dance as another Terra Blast goes in for huge damage. That's a max roll Terra Blast, and it reveals a choice item, but interestingly enough, it doesn't actually reveal if it's physical or special, since this would have been a mid-roll for a choice banded Terra Blast. Still though, I think Matt can reasonably infer this is a Specs Regidrago now. Mimikyu is going to Shadow Claw and try to pick this up as KO, but Regidrago survives on 9 and KOs back with another Terra Blast. Regidrago's defense investment really paid off here, since Mimikyu's Shadow Claw was a near guaranteed KO on max HP Regidrago, but it was never KO in this EV spread, topping out at about 94%. That's a positive trade for Greg. Mimikyu was a big threat, but he did have to reveal his Terra and allow his only real immediate breaker to get chipped down to very low health, so both teams have already expended some resources. The Espathra is going to be their revenge, but Greg decides to save Regidrago and bring in Scizor relatively easily on the Lumina Crash. Having Regidrago tucked in the back could be very nice for later, with the ability to absorb T-Spikes or come in against Dondozo to fire off a Specs Draco. Well, now Matt has seen that the Scizor is extremely specially defensive, so he's got to get out of there. He'll go ahead and switch out to Qwilfish to eat up what is going to be the Pounce, and now Scizor needs to pivot out with U-turn into Diancie on the Toxic Spike setup, and not wasting any time, Qwilfish is going to get up a nasty Toxic on the Diancie as it goes for its Reflect, revealing that it's likely a dual screen set. Qwilfish is going to take this opportunity to set up another layer of T-Spikes as the Diancie goes for its Light Screen, and I do have to wonder if that second layer was worth it compared to just getting up a layer of spikes or switching out. With only 2 Pokemon on the opponent's side vulnerable to them, as well as a grounded poison type to absorb them, I'm not sure that'll amount to much, and we'll see that as the Scizor switches in on the Spikes setup. With nothing to do with Scizor, Qwilfish is going to have to switch out to Moltres, and Scizor is able to grab some momentum by U-turning out into Tatsugiri, which does reveal its Boots. Not wanting to risk one of his offensive pieces, Matt switches out to Qwilfish, and Tatsugiri, meanwhile, is able to spin away all of that hazard setup. Seeing a pretty good opportunity to get some damage off, Greg goes for a Surf into Qwilfish, but it gets hit with a Toxic for his troubles. And despite all of the hazards being spun away, Qwilfish, we're seeing it do a pretty good job of chipping down the right threats on Greg's team. Consider that with the two bulky fire resist, Diancie and Tatsugiri being chipped down, they've just been put on timers with that permanent Toxic chip racking up every turn. If Matt can wait the battle out through that chip damage, Moltres comes online as a game-ending threat. For now though, the Incineroar are going to have to weather the storm, and they'll choose to preserve the Qwilfish by bringing the Dozo in to tank that Surf. Tatsugiri is going to reveal a taunt, but Dondozo was just going for order up for some decent damage. The damage is reduced through Reflect, but with that toxic damage racking up, Tatsugiri is left at under half HP. That's some serious chip to it there. Here comes a new threat though, with the Rotom in to tank the Liquidation. Looks like Matt was trying to read something like the Diancie or the Scizor coming in. With no great switch-ins, Matt is going to have to choose a switch-in, and it's going to be Espathra to tank the Volt Switch, which is going to bring in the Scizor for a free hit. That is going to be on the Dondozo switch-in with a light Pounce, and then it's actually from Matt going to be a double back into Moltres on the U-turn out into Diancie for another rough matchup for the Incineroar. And it seems like Matt has been trying to get Flame Body to proc on the Scizor, but for the second time this battle, Greg does dodge the 30% chance. That's a 51% chance overall for that burn to happen on Scizor at this point. Anyway, Diancie is in, so Moltres is going to just switch out here, no U-turn, out to Iron Treads to eat up that Diamond Storm very easily. And it's actually going to be another double out from Matt back into Dondozo as Greg switches to Rotom. I think that double was an attempt to scout for body press on the Diancie, but I think it might have actually been really nice for Iron Treads to get up rocks while forcing Diancie out with the threat of Earthquake. Scouting Diancie set was certainly a safer play to preserve Iron Treads here. It just didn't happen to work out, as Greg had gone into Rotom to take a potential Earthquake or Iron Head. And here it is again, Rotom doing its job and being a huge problem for Dondozo to deal with. This Incineroar are going to have to bring in the Iron Treads, which is going to get burned by the Will-O-Wisp. That's an unfortunate burn, but the Incineroar did not have a single safe switch into Rotom at this point, other than maybe Espathra, which doesn't want any more chip damage. This was just a tough spot for the Incineroar, and the Corviknight capitalized on it very, very nicely. Now, the rocks are going to go up for the Incineroar, but they'll pay for it by taking a chunk from Leaf Storm. The burn damage negating leftovers does mean that any chip damage is permanent on this thing. With nothing left to do in the matchup, Iron Treads is going to just have to Volt Switch out into the Qwilfish, but Greg is actually going to read that really nicely by going for this Volt Switch of his own, bringing in Tatsugiri to threaten with either a Rapid Spin or a Surf KO. Matt is going to choose to still preserve the Qwilfish and correctly swap out into Dondozo on the Surf, but this does allow Tatsugiri to do anything it wants, which is just going to be a Rapid Spin. It gets that, but Dondozo is able to use that to get up a free Curse boost. And with one turn left on Tatsugiri's Toxic Timer, it'll go for something on its way out. It's going to be a Draco, but it misses and gets KO'd by an Order Up. That is an unfortunate Draco miss, but it only would have done about a third. That's still valuable chip damage that you're missing out on, though, especially if we're looking at this in the context of a late game Iron Valiant suite. You definitely need more chip on this Dondozo. Now, of course, the Rotom is just going to come in as the revenge, and I was going to make a comment that Dondozo could have gotten up a second Curse boost rather than trying to KO the Tatsugiri that was already going down to Toxic, but the Rotom does render that a moot point. Leaf Storm just does too much damage for Dondozo to ever win this matchup, so this is going to be a switch out to the Iron Treads, which does at least avoid damage from the Thunderbolt. Rocks are going to go up once again for the Incineroar, and Rotom misses its Leaf Storm, once again depriving the Corviknight of valuable chip damage. That's a nice turn for the Incineroar. Those rocks are permanent now that Tatsugiri is down, and they just went up essentially for free. I don't think this miss is quite as important, though. Iron Treads is already well within Iron Valiant range already. And once again, with nothing left to do in this matchup, the Iron Treads can only Volt Switch out into this Moltres, as Rotom whiffs another Leaf Storm. Now, obviously, this one is not nearly as important on the quad-resistant target, but come on, Rotom, did you forget your glasses for this battle? I think the real unfortunate thing here is that Rotom was even going for Leaf Storm there. Given that Iron Treads set up rocks and then swapped out last time it was in against Rotom, and you successfully read that with a Volt Switch, you might expect the same sequence again, since it looks like the Iron Treads can't really touch you. Instead, Rotom is sitting here with a near full health Moltres on the field. I don't even think Leaf Storm here was necessarily a misplay. You are looking at this in hindsight, but yeah, Volt Switch would have been elite here, wouldn't it? But Moltres is in safely, and it's a big threat. But it's actually going to double back to the Iron Treads as Greg sacks Regidrago to the rocks. From Greg's point of view, he either had to take more chip damage on Diancie or sack something to Moltres, so using your Regidrago sack here is a fair play. And it looks like Matt was banking on the Diancie coming in with that double, but instead we're back in with the Iron Treads. And of course, with Iron Treads in and switch initiative on the Corviknight side, Rotom is going to be into Revenge. To be fair, it might have always been Matt's best play to prevent that Diancie from coming in for free after Moltres claims a KO. Screens would be tough to deal with at this point of the game, so I do like bringing in Iron Treads here. But Rotom is going to be tough to deal with, once again. With no safe switch-ins, Iron Treads withdraws directly into Espathra, which takes a big chunk from Thunderbolt. Espathra is in and now, so it's going to go ahead and set up this Calm Mind, which allows it to take the Volt Switch a little better before Scizor comes in. And actually, interesting note about that last turn, but going for Calm Mind there still risked a roll to KO from Leaf Storm, about a 44% chance by my estimation, but I suppose there was no need to do that when Scizor is still such a good stop to this. Bullet Punch would always KO here, but Scizor is just going to tank a boosted Shadow Ball before U-turning out for the KO, likely trying to cover a switch out. U-turn will bring in the Rotom, and with the switch advantage, the Incineroar will bring in the Moltres. And honestly, I was not too sure about that switch to Rotom. Right now, Moltres looks like the last thing you want to allow in for free, so I think Diancie or Iron Valiant immediately would have been better here. I probably would have brought in Diancie to set up at least one screen for the endgame, as he could even tank Earthquake from a burned Iron Treads at this point. Instead, we're looking at the Moltres again, and Greg is forced out into that Diancie. And from this health, that's not a switch-in. That's a sack. Moltres reveals the Life Orb to easily KO with one Flamethrower into another one, and all of a sudden things aren't looking too good for the Corviknight. That's your last Fire Resist and your Screen Setter down for the count. And then we have Scizor actually coming in as a revenge, since Moltres is actually not yet in range of Iron Valiant. Thunderbolt tops out at 59%, so this Scizor revenge looks like an attempt to force a little bit more chip on the Moltres. Moltres is actually going to switch out though, probably trying to avoid that exact chip damage. Iron Treads is going to come in on the Pounce, which I actually really like as a way to punish Roost from Moltres and make it slower than Rotom. But oddly enough, on this turn, we're going to see a swap back right out in the Moltres on the close combat. And then, with a free Flamethrower, it just KOs the Scizor. Once again, I don't know why the Moltres swapped out there. Maybe it swapped out as a way to scout for some weird shenanigans from the Scizor, and then once Matt realized it wasn't doing much, just swapped back in. Even then, I would think just sacking Iron Treads would have been the better play there to at least preserve health on Moltres. Yeah, I don't know, I could have been missing something there. Regardless though, Scizor did do its job. Moltres has been brought down into Iron Valiant range, so we're going to go for it. That will be the revenge as it pops its booster energy. And because Moltres is basically the only mod left on the Incineroar side that can still beat Rotom, it will need to be preserved, so Qwilfish is sacked to the Thunderbolt. That's going to bring in Iron Treads next, which is just taken out by an Aura Sphere. That does look like an odd choice for a revenge, but I don't think it's as bad as it might look. Maybe it's a waste of an opportune sack later, but this was probably Iron Treads' last chance to do anything in this matchup between not being able to touch Rotom and just getting KO'd by Iron Valiant. At least here you learn that it has Aura Sphere, so that could be useful information. We are now down to a 2-2 game as the Dondozo is going to come in. And Thunderbolt is only doing 31% as Liquidation does pretty much the exact amount in return. Unfortunately for the Corviknight, Iron Valiant cannot outdamage the Dondozo, and even if the Tatsugiri Draco Meteor had hit its mark earlier on, Iron Valiant would not be able to outdamage Rest Recovery, unfortunately. So, realizing that, Greg is going to immediately swap into Rotom, as Dondozo just goes for liquidation. And just like that, Rotom has actually found another free Thunderbolt opportunity. The Incineroar are in a pretty tough position here. Moltres needs to come in to beat this, but that does require a Dondozo sack. So Rotom is just going to hit a few Thunderbolts until Dondozo, not being able to retaliate with much, just a small order up there, it's going to be left with a very small sliver of HP as Rotom is brought down to about half. And here to take the KO, Rotom is going to click Thunderbolt one more time, bringing us to a Rotom versus Moltres endgame, instead of using Volt Switch to bring us to an Iron Valiant versus Moltres endgame. And I'll talk after the battle about the mechanics of that situation. Instead, though, all that's left for the Incineroar is Moltres, which has 38% of its health left to deal with Rotom and Iron Valiant. The Incineroar can definitely recognize that an agility boost is necessary to consistently beat the Iron Valiant waiting in the back, so it's almost mandatory that they use this turn to set that up. The question then becomes, will Moltres Terra ground or not? And will the Rotom read the Terra with Leaf Storm, or just go with the safe Thunderbolt? Even without knowing its agility, Greg will really want to get this Terra read correct to prevent any kind of shenanigans from the Moltres. Moltres does Terra ground agility, and it's immune to the Thunderbolt from Rotom. And that, folks, is going to be the game. From this range, Flamethrower easily KOs both the Rotom and the Iron Valiant for that last KO, giving the number 8 Incineroar the 1-0 victory over the number 1 Corviknight, knocking them out of the playoffs. What an exciting game to kick off playoffs, ending in an incredibly close upset with a lot to talk about. With the way this endgame played out, Moltres was the most obvious key to victory for the Incineroar, but let's not forget about the Qwilfish that got Toxics off into both Diancie and Tatsugiri, the two defensive pieces that had any ability to stomach a Flamethrower. Dondozo was also super important in stopping Iron Valiant and forcing it out of its booster energy for Moltres to outrun it on the last turn there. I'd say that the game plan came together quite well for the Incineroar. Qwilfish set a timer on the right Mons, which opened up Moltres' offense for the endgame. On the side of the Corviknight, they came very close to the victory there. One read on the Terra Ground Moltres with the Leaf Storm would have won them the game. Or at least it would have 90% of the time. That Leaf Storm, as we saw, it can miss, huh? That is a very tough read to ask for regardless, so we can't really fault the coach for making such a safe play going for Thunderbolt on that last turn. So let's actually instead turn our attention to a few turns earlier, when Rotom took out the Dondozo with Thunderbolt instead of Volt Switch. Oh boy, oh no. Excuse me, while I go through some technical difficulties here. Yeah, right here. So we saw how Thunderbolt played out, but what if the Rotom had Volt Switched out instead and left Iron Valiant to deal with Moltres? You might think that giving Iron Valiant the opportunity to take on Moltres before its agility boost would give it the edge, but actually we're left in the exact same 50-50 that we were in with Rotom in against Moltres. The Ground Terror type once again forces a read for the Corviknight to snag a win, forcing them to choose between going for Thunderbolt to secure the KO or Moonblast if they suspect the Terra into an electric resistant type. And if they get that read wrong, Moltres also wins the game in that scenario, as surprisingly enough, a resisted Moonblast from this range does not push the Moltres into range of Life Orb recoil before it's able to take out both of the remaining Pokemon on the Corviknight's side. All of this is made tougher for the Corviknight because they don't know Moltres' full moveset, meaning that there was a good reason to suspect that it could recover with Roost when that simply wasn't true. I would be willing to bet that this was influencing the decision-making by the Corviknight in the final moments of this battle, forcing out Thunderbolt on the Moltres due to the reasonable fear of it roosting while you try to read the Terra type. All of this is to say that I can't really fault the coach of the Corviknight for playing the way they did in the endgame. Without knowing the Moltres' full set, it really was a shot in the dark guessing what it was about to do. Regardless, great game to both coaches. The prep and play was stellar from both sides. We've really seen the league skill level on the rise lately, and one benefit of that is that we get to watch games like this a lot more often. Thanks to both these coaches for the great game that we got to dive into. Let's congratulate the Calgary Corviknight on an amazing season, and best of luck to the Cincinnati Incineroar on the rest of their playoff run. Alright, well, thank you all for watching. And as the usual Match of the Week host would say, remember to do all of that YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, all that. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.